the theory now is eliminative materialism, which is the theory that the mind doesn't exist at all, that it's only the brain. So it's not that there's a mind-brain problem. There's no mind-brain problem because there's no mind. And basically the argument that eliminative materialists have made, Patricia Churchland, this person whose lecture I went to, has been one of its main proponents, is that our ideas about the mind are what she calls folk psychology, meaning they're kind of myths that we tell. But the only thing that's real is the brain. The mind is just a misunderstanding of sorts. The problem with that, of course, is that you can't make a coherent argument that there are no arguments. That is, that in order to make a logical argument, to use reason and evidence and logic, those are all mental entities. And you can't put those together in a way that logically says the only thing that exists are physical entities. So if you're saying that there is no such thing as the mind, then you can't say anything more, because anything more than that is the mind. You can't make an argument if you say that there are no arguments. So it's self-contradictory, it's self-refuting, as is a lot of materialism. The computer functionalism argument that you mentioned, that the brain is the hardware and the mind is the software. There are all sorts of problems with that. The problem that's most famous with that is a thought problem proposed by John Searle, who's a philosopher of mind, back several decades ago. It's called the Chinese room problem. And so Searle said, okay, so you're claiming that computation is kind of like the mind. He said, imagine that you get a job, you go to China, and you are working in a little booth that's in a public square. And the little booth is basically analogous to a computer. And what happens is that Chinese people come up to your booth, they hand you a piece of paper asking you a question, and it's written in Chinese, and you don't understand Chinese at all. You've got a huge book inside the booth that is written all in Chinese. And on one side of the book, there are every Chinese question that could be asked. And on the other side of the book, there's every answer in Chinese to every question. And all you do is you take this little piece of paper and you match it to one of the questions, and then you write down in Chinese the answer and you give it back to the guy. You don't understand anything. You don't know Chinese. You're just matching symbol to symbol. The person outside the booth treats you like a computer. He gives you an input, you give him an output. It's like computation. The person outside the booth might say, wow, this computer is pretty smart. He understood the question I asked and gave me an answer. But you don't understand anything. Computers don't know anything. They're just matching an input to an output like in the Chinese room. So what Searle said is that there's nothing in computation that implies understanding. It's just pattern matching. And pattern matching is not the same thing as thinking. So what I think is the case is that computation necessarily involves, metaphorically, syntax, but never semantics. That is, computation is a particular pattern of electrons that you're sticking into a computer, and the computer gives you out another pattern of electrons according to a set of rules, which is the algorithm. Thinking always involves meaning and doesn't necessarily involve syntax. That is, when I think of something, like I'm thinking of Washington, D.C., or I'm thinking of my family, I'm thinking of a bottle of soda. When you say I'm thinking, there's always an of attached to it. There's always a meaning attached to what you're thinking about. But computers never have intrinsic meaning. They're just mechanical devices. So not only is thought not the same thing as computation, thought is the opposite of computation. Computation is always free of meaning. Thought always has meanings. So the mind is not software running on hardware. Software running on hardware is just computer stuff, and computers can't think, and it has nothing to do with thought. So we're the opposite of a computer in many ways.
That is super interesting. And what you're saying, tell me if I'm getting this right, but you're saying that the mind, in the same way that you could program a real physical computer using your intelligence, like using the part of you that is able to reason or think. When a neuroscientist looks and sees some physical part of the brain act up when there's arousal or love or whatever, you're saying that is the effect, not the cause of the thought or the experience or the emotion. Like the physical manifestation on the brain is downstream from the.
Sure. I think it can go both ways.
Okay.
There's no question that physical changes in the brain can change our thoughts. Just have a
Okay.
beer. Just if you have a beer, right? If you fall and hit your head, yeah, that changes your thoughts. You get knocked out. So there's no question that the arrow of causation can go from brain to mind.
Okay.
Very straightforward. That's what I work with every day is trying to keep the arrow of causation from involving like a neurological deficit where somebody has a problem because of a brain problem. But there's also, in my view, no question that the causation arrow goes the other way also, that mind can affect brain. There's a wonderful book called The Philosophical Basis of Neuroscience, written by a guy named Bennett and a guy named Hacker. Bennett is a neuroscientist from Australia, and Hacker is a philosopher from Oxford. And they write about sensible philosophy of how neuroscience can say things. And it's a great book. And they make the point that in these causal situations, what neuroscientists can say meaningfully is that there is a correlation between brain states and mind states often. Not always, but often. And you can talk about correlations, that a certain brain state tends to correlate with a certain mind state. And you could even say in some situations that there appears to be a causal relationship. But you can't take it farther than that. That is, you can't say that my feeling of love is the same thing as a brain state. That's not wrong. It's just nonsense. Because a brain state is not the same thing as a mind state. So you have to be very careful about how you phrase things, according to Bennett and Hacker, and they're quite right. That to say that a brain state and a mind state correlate is perfectly reasonable. The direction of causation arrows, much more subtle questions. Much more subtle questions. I think causation can go both ways.
Okay, that's really interesting.